I sat in my office all week trying the names in this passage. Knowing I was just going to go headlong into it Sunday morning, and I did. But that's okay. I think God forgives people who can't pronounce Hebrew very well. This week we're coming to the conclusion of our August sermon series, road trip of Palo, Pinto County, where we've looked at major landmarks in the area, in the county, and how they influence our faith or how they instruct us about our faith. And we've gone everything from Hell's Gate all the way through the football stadium. We've talked about crazy water, and we've talked about a lot of things. And we've come this week to the conclusion of that, though. And this week we're going to be talking about the Baker Hotel. The one very obvious thing. In fact, when I received the call from the bishop's office to come here, the call was a very normal call you get when you are learning that you're being moved. You get a call from your district superintendent, your supervisor, essentially, your boss. And it's always a very short to the point conversation. There's no little chit chat, how are the girls doing, how's life going? It's, hey, I'm sitting here with the bishop, and he would like to move you to here. And then, if you're fortunate or unfortunate, depending on how you view the circumstance, the next immediate question before you get to answer is, do you know where here is? So for me, the situation was similar. It said, we want to move you to Mineral Wells, First Methodist Church in Mineral Wells. Do you know where Mineral Wells is? And I was able to say yes. I was very proud of myself in that moment. Yes, sir, I know where Mineral Wells is. I have driven through it once. I like to imagine with shocked silence on the end that he was very impressed by that reality. But then he says, do you know where the church is? And I was like, no idea. I've only driven through it once. And as I continued the conversation, he said, well, the church is behind the Baker Hotel. Do you know what the Baker Hotel is? And again, I was able to say, yes, I know what that is, only because I've seen it on TV. It's a big hotel in downtown, right? The church is kind of by that? And he said, no, the church is directly behind that. And that was how I got accustomed to learning I was coming out here. And I bring that up because that's usually the first thing anyone says about our community. The first thing that draws attention when describing our area is the Baker Hotel. In fact, if you come into Palo Pinto County from the east on 180, you crest over the hill right past Cool. And what's the first thing you see? You see the valley, and you see the Baker Hotel. If you have really, really, really good vision, and you squint really hard, you see a little bitty tall brown thing beside the Baker Hotel. That's our belt. I don't recommend looking for it if you're driving, because you'll have to take your eyes off the road too long to see it. But the Baker, you don't have to. The Baker is plainly visible. And it's the same thing if you're coming north on 281, heading into Palo Pinto County the same way. I know I'm home because I round the corner and I go up the hill, and what do I see right there? The Baker Hotel. And in my head, I'm like, I'm home. It's the first thought. It is the cultural center of identity in our city, in our community, in our county. In one sense, all the roads in Palo Pinto County lead to the Baker. And if you try to go anywhere at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you know that reality because it's hard to turn out in front of the church sometimes. Fortunately, we live in Mineral Wells and our traffic jam is only about 4 cars deep. But I bring this up because this highlights the reality of what the prophet Haggai was sent to do. You'd be forgiven for not knowing Haggai was in the Bible. In fact, I don't know a lot of preachers who liked to work with the minor prophets, partially for what we've seen here today, in that they're hard to pronounce the names in them, but they're so short and there's not always a whole lot of background data on them. There's not a lot to go into. You know, you get one of the Gospels, and you can go into eons of research in it. People have been writing about it forever. People are excited. This is God incarnate on earth. Let's write about this. When you get to Haggai, it's one of the shortest books in the Old Testament. Not a lot of people are excited about Haggai. But what this prophet did, I think, is important because it relates so much to what we have sitting directly across the street behind me right now. He had a specific message from God. And what the passage we read today is actually him giving that message. That would be one of the climaxes of his book. Like I said, it was a short book. He starts to climax in the first chapter. But the whole message he gives is that they need to rebuild the temple. The people of Israel have come back from exile if things are going great. They've built their homes, they've built their businesses and their crops back up. But now God sends them a message. It's time to rebuild the temple. And so Haggai goes and he gives them the message and they rebuild the temple at the end of the book. Told you it was a short story. But I bring it up because of what Haggai was really rebuilding. See, the temple isn't just bricks and mortar. It's just not stone and finishes and building material. But Jesus has been very clear. The temple is something more. And there are two instances he gives us a glimpse of what that more is. The first one, as I've referenced the last couple of weeks, is he's walking through Samaria on the way to Jerusalem. He stops and he speaks with the woman at the well. And this has been kind of a background, secondary scripture in this whole series. But he speaks with the woman at the well, and the big conflict between the Samaritans, which this woman's a part of that group, and the Jewish people, which is kind of Jesus' group, is that they don't believe the same about where they're to worship. The Samaritans believe you're to worship on the mountains at handmade altars in the open, and the Jews believe it can only happen at the temple. And what is Jesus' response to this woman as she brings up this generational argument with Jesus standing there at the well? He says, "Lady, the true worshipers of God, the ones who really worship God, will worship in truth and the Spirit." I want you to hold on to that spot. The real worshipers of God, the folks who really worship God, worship Him in truth and the Spirit. I want you to hold on to that idea. Because further down the line, once Jesus gets to Jerusalem, he's encountered by the religious leaders in front of the temple. Not too long after he enters Jerusalem. And he tells them, as he's standing in front of the temple, "In 3 days I will tear down this temple, and in 3 days it will be raised up again." And they turn to him. This is where it's kind of interesting. They turn to him and say, "How can you do that? That's impossible. It took us generations to raise up this temple, the temple in Jerusalem, the one that Isaiah is talking about in his prophecies to the people." They say, it took us generations. It took our fathers and their fathers and their fathers generations to put all the stones in place and get the money to raise up the altar and to construct the ark. Can you imagine how many bake sales their women had to do to create the Ark of the Covenant? Just think about that for a minute. So when Jesus says to them, "This temple I will tear down, and in 3 days I will raise it up again," they think he is crazy. But these two statements about the temple here and about where people worship here from one another are actually connected and emphasize what Haggai says in his prophecy. See, the temple, although built of stone and wood and gold in Jerusalem, our temple built of wood and mortar and bricks and a few leaks here and there, it's just a symbol of what the real temple is. And the real temple is our spirit, where the Spirit of God can dwell in us. In fact, Paul even understood this and went on to explain this further down in his letters, where he told his followers, don't you know you're a spirit of God? Or don't you know you're a temple for the Spirit of God? Your body is a temple unto itself. So in reality, when Haggai is asked to push the people to rebuild the temple, he's not just asked to help them rebuild a physical structure, although that's the focus of their work at times, but they're rebuilding their identity in God. They're rebuilding their communal identity. They're rebuilding who they are personally. They're rebuilding the temples of their bodies that they might be indwelt with the Holy Spirit again. Around for us here in Palo, Pinto County, where we have a structure that is not unlike a temple to us. It's a structure by which our identity is framed. So I ask you this, can't we begin to rebuild not the physical temple of our community? Sure, we could all run across the street with the tools we think we need to rebuild it and start that way, although we'd probably all end up in jail somehow. I'm not sure there are enough police in Mineral Wells to arrest everyone. But I encourage you this, the real temple that Haggai is pushing the people of Israel to build isn't just the physical, it's a spiritual temple. The temple of the community in which everyone houses the Holy Spirit in themselves. It's inviting people to worship in truth in the Spirit, like Jesus talked about with the woman at the well. Or it is raising up a new kind of temple in 3 days in the person of Christ as Jesus combats the Sadducees in front of the temple. I encourage you, as a church, where can we begin to rebuild that temple for our community? Not the baker itself, but the community that it represents. As people of Christ, where can we begin to invite our community? And in what ways can we begin to invite our community to worship in truth and the Spirit? In what ways can we be a part of Christ's temple that was raised up in 3 days and built? In what ways can we begin to rebuild the identity of the community that sits across the street from us decaying now? Because I believe as a people of faith, we've been called to help rebuild that identity. We've been called, like the people in Israel and Haggai, to begin to rebuild the temple, but maybe not use bricks and stone and mortar. But we're called to rebuild the relationships. We're called to rebuild the community. We're called to rebuild the identity that has been lost in the destruction of the building across the street. We're called to rebuild the grandeur of our town. And whether we do it with or without a building, I think is irrelevant to God. In fact, the only thing I think that really matters is that we answer the call to help rebuild that spiritual temple. That we as people of faith can rise up and make a difference. And if you don't think there's a difference that needs to be made, I encourage you, just look around the community. Almost 70% of our students are on free or reduced lunch. Almost 40% of the citizens of Mineral Wells live under the federal poverty line. I didn't really understand the depth of what that meant until I looked it up this week, or actually a couple weeks ago. So that means 70% of people, 40% of people in our community live at or below $24,000 a year in income if they're a family of 4. If you're only a single person, that's $12,000 a year approximately. If you don't think the temple needs to be rebuilt spiritually in our community, Turn to social media and see the anger and the vitriol about anything that comes up in the community. Look at the pain that people go through. If you don't think our community needs to be rebuilt, go talk to some of the people who just walk the streets and hear their stories and how hopeless some of them have become. Folks, the community, the temple, not the actual physical temple behind us, but the spiritual one that is the heart of our city, its actual community does need to be rebuilt. These people need to be healed. The negativity needs to be calmed. Those who hurt need to be comforted. And folks, God calls us specifically to that work. I invite you as we close this sermon series, as we move on into the fall and begin to look forward to new sermon series, we begin to look forward to all the activities that the fall brings, to think about that. Think about how you're answering that call that Haggai issues to rebuild the temple, the spiritual temple, the community around us. It doesn't take a lot. It doesn't take running out and becoming a politician, or does it take having lots of money and rebuilding physical structures? Sometimes it just takes common decency. Sometimes it just takes caring for those who are invisible to everyone. Sometimes it just takes acknowledging the issues at hand. But I encourage you as we go into the fall, find whatever small way you can and help join in God with rebuilding the spiritual temple of our community. I invite you to join me in prayer.